They fired at the bomber and missed, but the bomber still fell out of the sky. Not because a shell hit it, but because a shell passed close enough, a near miss, that suddenly started killing like a direct hit. And in the middle of a global war, that shouldn't have been possible. Because if you can't hit a plane, you can't stop what's coming next. This is the story of the Proximity Fuze, a weapon so quiet, so small, and so secret, it changed anti-aircraft war in a single season and rewrote the math of survival above the battlefield. If you value calm, long-form World War II stories that go deeper than headlines, subscribe to WWII Diaries. Now, back to the story. In the early years of World War II, the sky became a moving deadline. Bombers came in waves, dive bombers dropped fast and low, torpedo planes skimmed the sea until the last seconds, and later the threat would become stranger. Pilotless weapons, then suicide attacks, then the idea of a target that did not care if it lived. But even before all of that, anti-aircraft gunners faced the same brutal truth. Hitting an aircraft is not the same as shooting at a ship. A ship is big. A ship stays roughly where physics says it must be. An aircraft is thin and fast, and it is allowed to change its mind. Most anti-aircraft fire in that era was a prediction engine. You measured speed, direction, altitude. You tried to calculate where the plane would be when the shell arrived. Then you fired. And usually, you watched the sky fill with bursts that were close enough to look impressive, but far enough to be harmless. People sometimes imagine that wartime gunners simply aimed better as the war went on. They did improve. They trained harder. They built better directors and radars. But the deeper problem remained. The war was getting faster. Aircraft didn't politely fly into a perfect solution. They came through cloud and smoke. They jinked and dove. They attacked at night. They appeared in the worst weather because the worst weather hid them. So the question became painfully simple. What if you could stop demanding a perfect hit? What if the shell didn't have to strike the aircraft at all? Only pass near it? Because a shell that passes near an aircraft is already a threat. It is already moving at lethal speed. It already contains explosive and metal. The problem was timing. A shell that does not hit the aircraft must still explode at the right instant. Too early and the fragments spread out into nothing. Too late and the fragments chase empty air. For years, the common answer was the time fuse. You set a timer before firing. The timer counted down. The shell burst. It was an elegant idea. It was also a gamble, because the timer was only as good as the guess you made at the gun. And even small errors, fractions of a second, could mean the burst happened tens of meters away. A near miss became a clean miss. So engineers and scientists began chasing a different dream. A fuse that could decide for itself when it was close enough. Not a fuse that waited for impact. Not a fuse that obeyed a preset clock. A fuse that sensed proximity. It sounds obvious when you say it slowly. But in 1940, it sounded like fantasy. Because you weren't talking about placing a sensor on a calm platform. You were talking about putting delicate electronics inside the nose of a shell, then firing it from a gun with brutal acceleration, violent spin, heat, shock, vibration, and demanding that it remain sane, stable, and accurate. You were asking a piece of metal thrown into chaos to behave like a measuring instrument. And yet, that is exactly what they built. The first miracle was not the idea of proximity. The first miracle was survival. A projectile fired from a naval gun experiences forces that crush, shake, and tear apart normal components. In the early 1940s, electronics were built around vacuum tubes, fragile glass devices that did not like being dropped, much less launched like a hammer strike from a cannon. The proximity fuse had to endure launch, then begin working only after it was safely away from the gun and ship. It needed safety mechanisms to prevent it from detonating too soon. It needed a power source that would not drain in storage, but would become active in flight. It needed consistent manufacturing, because it works most of the time, is not a comfort in anti-aircraft warfare. And above all, it needed to be small. A concept can be brilliant at any size. A weapon must fit where the weapon goes. So the project became a war inside engineering. Miniaturization, ruggedization, reliability. In the United States, the push gathered under the wartime research system built to mobilize science quickly, and one of the critical storylines runs through a group known as Section T, led by physicist Merle Tuve, and through the creation of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, an organization formed in secrecy to address the urgent problem of defending ships from air attack. The Proximity Fuze program began with multiple concepts: photoelectric, acoustic, and radio, before the radio approach became the decisive path. It's worth pausing on that because it tells you something about wartime invention. The finished weapon looks inevitable only after it exists. Before it exists, everything is a question mark. Photoelectric ideas meant sensing light changes. Acoustic ideas meant listening for engines. Radio meant a different kind of vision, an invisible signal and its echo. Radio was the path that became famous. Not because it was romantic, because it could be made to work in the dark, in cloud, in chaos. The simplest way to understand the radio proximity fuse is to picture this. The shell is not only a projectile, it is a tiny transmitter. It sends out radio waves. Those waves bounce off a target, metal skin, wing surfaces, fuselage. As the shell approaches, the reflected signal grows stronger and changes in character. When the signal reaches a threshold, close enough, the fuse triggers detonation. The shell doesn't need to touch the aircraft. It needs to pass through a bubble of danger. And this is where near miss becomes a lethal term. But the science alone didn't win the war. The proof had to be violent proof, fired proof. In August 1942, tests were conducted under conditions meant to resemble combat, including firings against radio-controlled drone aircraft over Chesapeake Bay. Observers described the results as spectacular, with drones brought down quickly with very few shells. That kind of result wasn't merely promising, it was transformational. And then the secret had to become real ammunition. There are inventions that remain rare. They exist as prototypes. They win awards. They do not change the battlefield. To change the battlefield, you must build thousands, then millions. You must standardize, you must test, you must ship. You must train crews to use the new thing without ever being told too much about it. And you must keep it secret, because this was not simply a tool. It was an advantage that could evaporate if copied. A proximity fuse that fell into enemy hands could be studied, reverse engineered, countered. Secrecy in this story wasn't paranoia. It was strategy. Early rules limited where proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells could be used. Over open ocean, a dud shell that didn't explode would splash and disappear. Over land, it might be recovered. So the earliest combat use leaned toward naval defense. Then came a date you can circle with ink. January 5th, 1943. Near Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, the light cruiser USS Helena fired proximity-fused 5-inch shells in combat and shot down a Japanese dive bomber, an early, widely cited proof of effectiveness under real conditions. That moment matters not only because a plane fell, it matters because the way it fell was new. Anti-aircraft crews had always dreamed of near-miss kills, but dreams are not doctrine. Doctrine changes when the weapon changes the odds. Once a shell can detonate near a target automatically, the gunner's job shifts. The fire control system still matters. Aiming still matters, but the requirement for perfection loosens. Instead of demanding that the burst happen at exactly the right time, you let physics decide in the last instant. Instead of asking, "Did we hit it?" you start asking, "Did we get close enough?" And close enough suddenly became achievable. This is the quiet psychological shift the sky felt first. Pilots have always feared flak, but there's a difference between fearing direct hits and fearing proximity. A direct hit is rare. A near miss is common. The proximity fuse weaponized what was common. It turned the air around the aircraft into danger. And once that happens, every attack profile becomes harder. Low passes don't automatically save you. High altitude doesn't automatically save you. Speed doesn't automatically save you, because the shell doesn't need to touch you anymore. It only needs to come close while you are still close enough to be shredded. That doesn't mean the proximity fuse was magic. It didn't erase the need for guns, directors, radar, training. It did something subtler. It forgave human and mechanical error just enough to matter. And in war, just enough is often decisive. A huge part of this story is how invisible the device was to the people it killed. A pilot didn't see a new aircraft in the defense line. He didn't see a new gun. He didn't necessarily hear anything different. He simply found that the sky's near misses had become final. On ships, the difference could be measured in minutes and bodies. A ship under air attack lives in time fragments. Seconds to detect, seconds to track, seconds to engage. If anti-aircraft fire becomes even modestly more effective, it changes the survival curve. Not by making every attack fail, but by making enough attacks fail soon enough. And as the war went on, the proximity fuse would become tied to the nightmare of late war attacks in the Pacific, when aircraft came in not to escape but to collide. When a pilot is trying to crash into you, scaring him away is no longer a strategy. You must physically stop the aircraft. That's where the proximity fuse's effect could feel almost like a new category of defense, because it increased the probability that the aircraft would be damaged, destabilized, or destroyed in that last lethal run. But the other half of this story is not in the sky, it is on the ground. Because once you build a fuse that detonates when it senses something nearby, you don't only have an anti-aircraft tool, you have an airburst tool. A shell that explodes in the air, above people, can be deadlier than a shell that buries itself into earth and explodes half-muffled. They are not wasted digging craters. They are not blocked as easily by shallow cover. A trench that saves you from a ground burst can become less comforting if metal is raining down from above. This is why the proximity fuse became infamous in ground combat once restrictions loosened. But those restrictions existed for a reason. Secrecy wasn't a slogan, it was a policy. And yet policy meets reality. By 1944, Europe demanded everything the Allies could bring. Then came the crisis in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. In U.S. Army historical accounts of the Ardennes fighting, the proximity fuse is described as a tightly guarded American secret that received its first major battle test in a ground role there, with roughly 200,000 rounds prepared for use on the continent in December. And once it was used, the effect could feel disproportionate to the size of the device, because the device didn't add more shells. It made shells behave differently. Artillery barrages had always been terrifying, but in many conditions, mud, forest, snow, shells that impacted the ground could waste part of their lethal energy. Airburst over infantry formations changed that geometry, and it changed morale. A soldier can endure many things if he believes there is a pattern he can survive. A foxhole, a trench, a tree line. But when the danger comes from above, the pattern fractures. This is one reason commanders remembered it as a turning point. A famous quote attributed to General George Patton is that the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge, and that once all armies had it, they would need to devise a new method of warfare. Whether you treat that quote as literal diary language or as the polished memory of staff, the sentiment is telling. People recognize that this was not just another incremental improvement. Still, the proximity fuse was not a single-use miracle. Its greatest power was how well it fit into larger systems. Because the late war became a battle of systems, radar to detect and track, directors to compute firing solutions, guns to send shells into the predicted space, fuses to make near misses lethal. The most famous system story is the defense against the V-1 flying bomb. The V-1 was not a bomber you could intimidate. It was not a pilot you could rattle. It was a machine with speed, low altitude, and a straight purpose. It was hard to shoot down because it was small, fast, and appeared in volume. And in that fight, the Allies learned something profound. You don't defeat a difficult target by demanding perfection from humans. You defeat it by stacking advantages. A radar like the SCR-584 provided accurate tracking. A fire control computer like the M9 gun director translated that tracking into continuous aiming corrections, and proximity fuse shells made those corrected near misses lethal. In historical summaries of these weapons, the combination of SCR-584, the M9 director, and proximity fuses is repeatedly described as one of the most effective anti-aircraft systems of the war, crucial against V-1 attacks. And notice the deeper lesson. The proximity fuse didn't need to be perfect. It needed to be good enough that the system became overwhelming. There is a cold beauty to that. Because the V1 campaign forced defenders to measure success not in heroic moments, but in statistics. How many incoming weapons were destroyed? How many got through? How quickly could crews improve their rates? In some historical accounts of Britain's V1 defense, the improvement in gun effectiveness is described as dramatic once technical changes, including proximity fuze, were introduced and refined. This wasn't a single secret weapon in isolation. It was the last critical piece that turned a tracking solution into a kill. And that is why this story can sound like science fiction, even though it's history. A shell in the air, spinning at enormous speed, carrying a transmitter and receiver in miniature form. Listening for the echo of a target, then detonating itself at the moment it is closest. That is not a normal expectation for 1940s technology. Which brings you back to the part of the story that is easiest to ignore, manufacturing. The proximity fuse didn't win influence because it existed. It won influence because it could be built in massive numbers with consistent quality. By the end of the war, the figure over 22 million produced appears repeatedly in reputable summaries, including accounts linked to Johns Hopkins and Navy historical writing. Millions of units mean the weapon is no longer a curiosity. It becomes a layer of reality. And mass production demanded a nationwide effort. Factories, subcontractors, quality control, testing regimes that were punishing even by wartime standards. This is why the proximity fuse was sometimes described as not only a scientific achievement, but an industrial one. A small device becomes powerful when it becomes common. There is another detail in this story that feels almost theatrical: the name. VT. Many people learn that VT stands for variable time, a phrase deliberately bland enough to avoid revealing the true method. Some accounts credit a Navy ordnance official with coining the term as a descriptive cover, while other technical histories describe the letters as a bureau code label. Exactly the kind of ambiguity you'd expect from a secret project traveling through paperwork and logistics. The fog around the letters is part of the design. In war, secrecy doesn't only hide blueprints, it hides meaning. You want crates to move without drawing attention. You want labels that don't tell the story. Because the moment the enemy knows what to look for, the moment the enemy knows what to recover, your advantage shrinks. And the fear of recovery was real. Early limits on land use weren't superstition. They were fear of capture. A dud fuse on land is evidence. Evidence becomes a project. A project becomes a counter. That is why, even after success at sea, broad land use remained restricted for a time. And yet, the war kept moving. By late 1944, the priority shifted from secrecy to survival. When the Allies faced pressure from V1 attacks and then the Ardennes crisis, policies bent. In the Ardennes, the proximity fuse's ground role became not a theoretical future, but an urgent present. And when it worked, it left behind a kind of battlefield rumor. A sense that artillery had changed personality, not louder, not necessarily more frequent, but more final. More unfair in a way that war always becomes once one side learns a new trick. Because the proximity fuse did not only increase lethality, it attacked the idea of shelter. And that is always terrifying. On ships, it attacked the attacker's confidence. A pilot could once believe that weaving in speed might carry him through a wall of bursts. Now the wall grew thicker. On land, it attacked the defender's comfort. A soldier could once believe that the ground would absorb part of the blast in fragments. Now the blast could be suspended above him. This is why the story of this device can feel larger than its size. It changed where danger lived, not only on impact, in space, in nearness. But you can't tell the story honestly without admitting something else. It wasn't purely American. The wider wartime scientific exchange mattered. In many histories of the proximity fuse, British concepts and early work are discussed alongside the American engineering and manufacturing effort that ultimately produced operational shells at scale. You can argue over priority, patents, and who invented the idea first, but the battlefield outcome came from making it rugged and manufacturable in a form that could survive gun launch and function reliably. That is an uncomfortable truth about invention. The idea and the weapon are not the same thing. Many people can have a correct idea. Only a few can make it survive war, which returns you to the engineers and to what they were really building. They were building trust, Not the kind of trust you feel emotionally, the kind of trust a ship feels when it turns into the wind under attack and believes its guns have a chance. The kind of trust a commander feels when he orders a barrage and believes the bursts will happen where they matter. This trust did not appear overnight. It was manufactured, tested, broken, fixed, tested again. And when the weapon finally entered combat, it entered as a whisper. No dramatic new sound, no new silhouette in the sky, just a shift in probability. And probability in the end is how wars are often decided. Consider the pre-proximity world. A gun crew fires, the shells burst. They might be close, but close doesn't always mean lethal. Now consider the proximity world. A shell passes near an aircraft. The fuse senses the reflected signal. The shell bursts at the moment the aircraft is within its kill radius. The same gun, the same crew, the same sky. But the meaning of miss changes. And when the meaning of miss changes, the entire war above the horizon changes with it. There is a temptation to tell this story like a triumph and stop there. But if you are honest, the story is also about escalation. Because once you show that electronics can be miniaturized and ruggedized and mass-produced inside munitions, the door opens. It opens to smarter fuses, smarter guidance, smarter sensors. It opens to a world where weapons begin making decisions. The proximity fuse is not modern AI. It is not a thinking machine in the human sense, but it is a mechanical decision close enough, detonate, and it is a decision made without a person in the loop at the final instant. That is a turning point in the emotional history of warfare because it reduces the last moment to a threshold. No pity, no hesitation, just physics. Even the people who built it understood its weight, not always in moral terms, often in tactical terms. They spoke about the weapon as a gunner's dream because gunners knew what it meant to do everything right and still watch targets survive. They knew the fatigue of firing thousands of rounds into the sky. They knew the frustration of good bursts that were still not close enough. And then suddenly, the war gave them a device that made close enough count. But the full reality is that the proximity fuse didn't merely help gunners. It punished attackers. It made the approach corridors narrower. It forced higher losses for the same mission. It increased the cost of air power in certain contexts. And when the cost rises, strategy changes. Attack patterns change. Altitude changes. Approach angles change. Willingness changes. Because behind every sortie is a calculus. How many aircraft can you lose and still keep flying? The proximity fuse was one of those small devices that could push that calculus. Not alone, not everywhere, but enough to matter. In the Pacific, the device became tied to the desperate, brutal late war, to air defense against attacks that were no longer attempts to return home. In Europe, it became tied to the technical defense against a weapon that didn't have a pilot at all. And on the ground, it became tied to the winter fight in the Ardennes, when the front bent and the Allies needed every advantage they could safely release. It is difficult to find another device that touched so many domains so quickly, and yet most people outside specialist histories barely notice it, because it isn't cinematic. There is no heroic silhouette to put on a poster. A proximity fuse is a small cylinder of metal and circuitry that you never see in action. You only see what it does after it acts. A plane disintegrates, a formation breaks, a trench becomes less comforting. The device itself remains invisible, and that invisibility is part of its power. There is also a final irony. For all its secrecy, the proximity fuse became, after the war, a symbol of how rapidly scientific mobilization could transform combat. It became a case study in how governments, universities, and industry could lock together in a single purpose. It became part of the origin story for institutions that would outlive the war and shape the Cold War world. The Applied Physics Laboratory itself is often described as having been formed in early 1942 to address the urgent air defense challenge for Navy ships, with the proximity fuse as a foundational accomplishment. So the device did not only change the sky in the moment, it changed the future quietly by proving a new kind of development pipeline could work. And this is where the story becomes less comforting, because once you prove a pipeline, you can use it again. The proximity fuse is a story of defense, of saving ships, of stopping attacks, of increasing survival odds, but it is also a story of capability. And capability rarely stays on one side of history forever. After World War II, proximity fuses evolved. Guidance evolved. Sensors evolved. And the world entered an age where the distance between almost and enough shrank in many arenas. That is the legacy hidden inside this little device. It made war more precise in the worst way. It made near misses lethal. It changed what the sky allowed. And perhaps the strangest part is this. Most of the people it killed never knew it existed. They died believing they had been hit, when in reality, they had only been almost hit. So here is the question that hangs after the technical marvel fades. In the wars we remember, how many outcomes were decided not only by the generals whose names we can recite, but by the engineers who quietly changed what miss meant? And if a small secret can change the sky once, what does it mean for every sky after that?